Okay, good. So that's actually a good place for us to start. And it's something I'd mentioned in one of my previous calls about, I think it was the Buddha's advice to an Aikido sensei, is that, no matter where we're at the spectrum between student and teacher, or kohai and senpai, or kohai senpai sensei, no matter where we're at, we're all learners. We wouldn't be here today if we weren't learners. And in a way, when it comes to learning, it's helpful to understand how learning happens. It's helpful to understand how development happens. There's all kinds of developmental theories, but there's a woman called, I think, oh my gosh, I think it's Marilyn Schlitz. Schlitz is there's a beer brand, Schlitz. Yeah, that's it. Okay, everybody's raising me. I think that's her last name. Marilyn Schlitz. She's from IONS, which is the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, just north of the Bay Area. And at the Institute, they had actually taken all these learning methodologies that could take somebody from zero to some type of developmental stage or developmental level or some skill set or change in perspective or transformation. And they tried to figure out what are the nuts and bolts of learning. And at IONS, they kind of, after doing this for several years and looking at cross lineage, across several traditions, how learning and development happen, they saw that there's universally, there's 5 phases or 5 aspects to development that we all go through. And that's what I want to kind of go into in the rest of today's call. And so I'll kind of lay out these 5 aspects, and then we'll go into, again, another practice session to discuss a little bit how these 5 aspects relate to us in our own practice. And first I'll say the 5, and then I'll break them down a little bit. So it begins, the first aspect, and these are kind of in order, but as a learner, you'll see that there's kind of a spiral or a circular aspect to them as well. So the first one is intention. The second aspect of development is attention. The third aspect of development is repetition. The fourth aspect of development is instruction. And the fifth aspect of development is reflection. So again, I'll say them: intention, attention, repetition, instruction, and reflection. These 5 things, when these 5 things are like seen to, when these 5 things are attended to, when these 5 things are taken care of, when these 5 things are satisfied, development kind of is the result. It's the byproduct. We're not doing this to develop. We're doing this because we want to pay attention, or we want to have our intention. We want to pay attention. We want to do it with repetition. We want to get instruction, and we want to have reflection. And when we do all those things, development is the result. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of break down each one of these 5 aspects and speak about them for a moment individually. And it begins with intention, and what we did already in the beginning of this call, since it's the beginning of the course, and it's always nice to do at the beginning of any learning that we sign up for. We say, I want to learn something, is to set your intention. When we set our intention, we kind of go inside and we kind of figure out within ourselves, why am I doing this? What is it that I want to get from this? And if it's worth it, I go for it. So we're actually setting the intention in our mind. So it's the intentional mind that actually helps us begin this practice. And many of you know that I have a Buddhist background, so this is, they talk about, they have this, not just 5 aspects of learning, but I think there's like 12 or 13 aspects from 0 to enlightenment. And the first one is intention. It's just, first you have to come into contact with the Dharma or some teaching or some truth or something beautiful in the world that kind of hits you between the eyes, and you go, wow. And then you kind of compare, or you instinctively compare that with your own situation, and then something in you wants to go for it. There's an intention to move towards it, and you approach that teaching or that teacher, and that's setting the intention. So there's the intentional mind. But the intentional mind is not the only thing that's part of this. We also have the intentional space. So the intentional space, of course, we're all Aikidoka here, so the intentional space would be the dojo, or it could be the Zoom room. That's why I was talking about before how important it is that we we have some type of Zoom etiquette, that we show up, yeah, that we're not multitasking in the background. Or if you do have to multitask, I have no judgment about that, but just turn off your video so it doesn't create a distraction. So the intentional mind is followed by the intentional space. And then you have intentional activities. Intentional space could also be your, waking up and making your bed, or, because I did quite a bit of meditation when I was a yogi. I'm not the most cleanest person in the world. I mean, the dojo is pretty damn clean, but I keep it in my apartment, my room. We have kids here, so it's not that easy, but we're straightening up all the time. And it just puts things in order. And when I was a yogi, I used to keep, I would go with 2 sets of clothes. I'd have one little inspirational book that I'd put on the shelf that I've almost never read, and my clock and whatever, toothbrush, and so almost nothing in the room. You got a bed. I know Eileen just came back from a retreat as well. It's like a yogi's room is like empty. You've got your bed, you've got your shoes, you've got your toothbrush, and maybe some soap and a towel, and that's all you need. And you keep it like everything ship shape. And Sadhu Pandita used to say to me all the time, it says, a clean and orderly environment reflects a clean and orderly mind. So an intentional space is also part of the intention. And whether you're doing this in your home or not, it doesn't really matter. But in the Zoom space, in this virtual space, we also want to kind of bring a certain intentionality to it. So we talked about intentional mind, intentional activities, doing good routines, intentional space, like a dojo, or just kind of, creating a clean, sharp, orderly space, and intentional community, which is our dojo. So this is this is where we support and challenge and help each other and push each other, and all in the spirit of learning. So there's the intention also comes through community, and then eventually it moves out into an intentional life. So all learning begins, all kind of transformation, all change begins with the first aspect of intention. But if it's only intention, only at the level of the mind, it means nothing. Next is attention. You have to pay attention to what you've put your intention towards. And this is really basic awareness training. It's being aware of what you're doing, and it's being aware of how you're doing it. And since we're all Aikidoka, the moment we step foot on a path of practice, whether it's Aikido, tea ceremony, meditation, calligraphy, relationships, therapy, whatever you consider like a higher, this is your path of practice. That first step on any path of practice is a step of self-awareness. Attention. We're paying attention to each and every step. And of course, mindfulness is the basic practice. The Buddha said mindfulness is helpful in all things. That means all places, all times, all circumstances. It's universal. It just brings benefit to whatever's happening. So but the thing with mindful, we have to remember to be mindful. It's so easy to slip to the past or the future, forget to be mindful. That's the kind of the unnatural state of our mind. So it is a practice. You have to have an intention to be mindful. You set the intention, and then you go about the practice of paying attention. And mindfulness is helpful in all things. It will just make things better. It just creates development. The other thing in terms of development, I mean, I could go to the gym and listen to music or listen to news and whatever, lift weights and run and whatever they do in the gym, and I would develop, but I don't have to pay attention to developing like that. This type of development that we're talking about is an internal development. It's how we grow internally on the inside. And paying attention is super important, because as it turns out, internally, we only develop in the now. If our mind is in the past or the future, or if we're fantasizing, or if we're lost in thought, or if we pay attention to the wrong things, we don't grow internally. Internal development, human development, moving towards our potential can only happen if we're in the present moment. And that's the attention practice. And in Aikido, we have all these great practices. The moment we walk in the dojo, you bow and you change your clothes, you step onto the mat, you sit, you bow, you sit in seiza, you line up. And then we go into all these great practices of, centering and connecting with each other, and maybe paying attention to all these different technical aspects of the art. But it's the attitude You know, the attitude and the posture and the internal and external attitude, the principles and the techniques, how they come together, that's the internal development. And then, of course, there's the deeper states like Zanshin and Mushin. These are all attention practices, awareness-based practices. So this second aspect is super, super important for any type of development. But it needs to be followed by the third aspect, which is repetition. You know, being super mindful for 10 minutes and then going, you know, spending a day that's just like out of, well, I shouldn't say that. But we need to have a certain amount of repetition with our practice. You know, I mean, I was 10 minutes of mindfulness is actually a good thing. I shouldn't say it's a bad thing, or if it's no good if you're not mindful after that, which is not necessarily true. But we want to come back and be mindful as much as possible. Or we practice our routines. And, you know, in martial arts, let's just say in Japanese arts, they have the beautiful tradition of kata. We have these amazing forms, these beautiful forms that we repeat again and again and again and again. We've set our intention. We're paying attention to who we are and how we are. And then we have our kata, we have our routines, and we have our habits, and hopefully good habits. And we repeat them again and again and again. Of course, with technical training, as we have in Aikido, that's obvious. But in the traditional Budo, Kobudo, the old Japanese martial arts, they had these 3 stages of mastery, and the first one was Shu. Shuhari. Shu means conformity. Ha is application. Ri is transcending or creativity. This first stage, Shu, it's conformity. You see the form, you copy the form, and you repeat the form. And that's that stage. It's really an amazing stage that it's just you become incredibly intimate with the form. First from the outside, and then as you repeat it again and again and again and again, it becomes internalized and it starts to express itself outward. Then the form begins to change. But if you change the form before that, you're kind of bypassing that repetition stage. So you set your intention, you've got attention, you set your intention, you're paying attention to the practice, and then you go through a series of repetitions. And this can be any type of practice. When you have repetition, it's a good thing. And hopefully it's, you know, I mean, it should be clarified. There's an old saying, I think, from Alexander technique, you know, or maybe it was Feldenkrais, I don't know who said it, but, you know, the old saying, practice makes perfect. Well, it's not necessarily true. Practice makes permanent. So if we practice some bad habit, or if we practice with our own personal bad habit, it can strengthen I'm just like I had an injured shoulder, so it becomes stiff, and I just keep practicing. I can strengthen that problem, that bad habit there. So, but with the proper attention, these habits, these repetitions will become purified. And, you know, we want to change. Gradually, we're changing temporary practices into more permanent traits of who we become and who we are. And again, it's not blind repetition, because if it was blind repetition, we wouldn't have attention. When you have attention or awareness, then the repetition is a purification process. So there's intention, attention, repetition, and that's followed importantly, and you can see why repetition alone is not good enough. We have to have the fourth aspect, which is instruction. We need an external eye, an external perspective from the outside, watching us, observing us, working with us as we repeat our practices. They don't have to hold our hands. They can meet us once a year, or once every 3 years, or once every 3 days, or they can do a whole hour class with us. But they give us that feedback from the outside, and then we take that feedback and we keep doing the repetition, because we've set the intention, we have the attention, we keep repeating, we get the instruction, we get the, the adjustments or the fine tuning, and we go through this repetition process, and it purifies because of the instruction. And of course, instruction, you know, from the external instruction of, obviously it's teachers. Some of us on the call are teachers, but since we're all learners, we all get instruction, either directly or indirectly from the outside. It could be senior students in the dojo. It could be mentors. It could be other members of our dojo community or our sangha. And they don't have to be our teachers. They can be our equals, or they can even be, you know, the children. My daughter, oh my God, she's teaching me every day of every moment. It's a little bit different than having a teacher, but the outside. But the reflection I get from her back to me is like a life lesson on a daily basis. So, you know, instruction is super, super important, and guidance or some type of external guidance to help us work with those forms is super important. And remember, there's two types of guidance. The guidance can be in the form of support, where it just looks at you and who you are and where you're at and says, yes, you are good. Just keep being good like that. Support. Or it can be in the form of challenge. Challenge is like, okay, where you're at is fine, but you can do better. So let's do better. You know, the masculine approach or the feminine approach is kind of challenging methodologies or the supporting methodologies. And whichever your particular preference is, the fact is we need a balance of those. And depending on the situation, depending on the circumstances, depending on the student, depending on the teacher, that should change back and forth. So first is intention. The second is attention. The third aspect was repetition. The fourth aspect is instruction. And the fifth aspect of learning or of development is reflection. Good old reflection. And reflection is the glue that holds it all together. You can literally have all of that stuff I mentioned before, but never for a moment reflect on your practice, and it's just going to kind of be out there in space. It doesn't really land in the mind. It doesn't really land in the body. It doesn't really land in the heart. If for us to kind of learn and kind of organize it around a new perspective, and then to be able to, like Brett was saying, share that with the world to help other people become, you know, a little more understanding, loving, compassionate, wise in their own lives, we have to have this reflection practice. You know, everything we're doing in the breakout, you know, the one we did before was kind of an introduction. But then as you started to talk about your intention, that's a reflection practice. I turn in, I check out my interior, and I share that with somebody else. They turn in, they check out their interior, they share that with me. I kind of look at my experience. What did that experience do to me? And I share that with somebody. The reflection is super, super important for development. In this sense, it's reflection as a practice. In one sense, it's like, you know, learning is you know, you have a map and you have a territory. And, you know, you look at the map, you hear the theory about a technique, and then you get on the mat and you practice and you walk the territory. Well, the reflection is actually stepping back and seeing how the map, okay, and the territory start to connect. You start to see how they are the same thing, or you start to see how they are incongruent. There's a gap there, or there's a problem there. And the reflection helps you understand that. The reflection helps you kind of work that through. If there are gaps or pieces of the puzzle missing, a deeper reflection or some type of inquiry will actually help to fill in the gaps, will help you find the pieces of the puzzle, will help the mind to expand to the degree that's needed, or the perspective to change that's needed to be able to see things in a new way and understand them. So reflection is absolutely important. So the 5 aspects of development, number 1 is intention. Number 2 is attention. Number 3, repetition. Number 4, instruction. And number 5 is reflection. So that's today's little teaching. So what I'd like to do now is, if nobody raises their hands, we're going to go ahead and put you back into a breakout group. And I want you to share with your group how these 5 aspects are reflected in your own practice. You know, where do you see yourself as being quite strong and solid? You know, I was always like really good at, if I just give an example, I was really good at repetition. kata, give me kata. Repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it, repeat it. But it wasn't always with attention. And it wasn't held in some bigger intention, like a bigger purpose. Why am I doing this? You know, sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. I usually was with a teacher, so I had always had good reflection with a teacher. And sometimes the teachers would turn my brain, other times they wouldn't. But reflection was usually pretty weak. When I say usually, I'm talking about in my younger days. It wasn't something I was so into. I just let me do it and practice. So in a way, I was missing the beginning and the end. But these days, I realize that those two, the intention and the reflection, are probably the strongest in me. So that's in a way that's how I can relate to it. But basically, you know, how do these 5 aspects relate to your practice? And where do you find is your strongest aspect? Intention, attention, repetition, instruction, or reflection? And where do you find is your weakest aspect? Or obviously instruction is an external aspect. So maybe if you don't have access to instruction as you would like, or if you have that, that's great. But of these 5 aspects, where would you say is the strongest part of your practice, whether you're a teacher or a student, or for all learners? And where would you say is your weakest aspect? Okay. So I saw a lot of people taking notes, but I'll just say these 5 things one more time in case you didn't get them. Intention, attention, repetition, instruction, and reflection. Okay. What's your strength? What's your weakness? Daniela?
Yes.
How many?
Ready?
How many in each group? Is it
3.
the same groups? It's different groups, right?
Mostly the same. I needed to make some adjustments. So you might find a new person in your room, but most of the rooms stayed the same.
Okay, great. So we will give you, it's 10 after, let's give you about 13 minutes for this one, okay? All right, everybody. Enjoy your breakout. We'll see you soon. The main room. Okay, Danielle, is that everybody?
Looks like it, yes.
Okay, great. So welcome back to the main room, everybody. I hope that your breakout session went well. We've got about another 8 minutes on today's call. By the way, remember at the end of each session, at the end of each 90 minutes, there's an additional 30-minute community cohort discussion for you to continue the conversation about the session of the day. It's optional. So if you can join, just stick around. We will, at the end, we'll put you back in another breakout and you can just hang out and talk. But if you have to leave, you have to leave. It's not a problem. 30 minutes is the suggested time. Like I said, the Zoom room is open forever for the next 3 months. So you can talk for 10 minutes. You can talk for another hour. It doesn't really matter, but we just recommend 30 minutes. So what I would like to do to finish off is I would love to hear a little bit of a harvest, how the breakout sessions went in your group. So if somebody would like to raise their hands and share, or if you have a question, you know, we can squeeze that in as well. But first, let's work with harvest and maybe share a little bit of the insights and wisdom that came out of your group. To raise your hand, just go to the Manage Participants button, click, and you will see the option to raise the hand. Daniela, can you open your mic for a second?
Sure.
I always say that, go to your Manage Participants button, but is that just something that I see?
Actually, because I'm also having like this host rights, I don't see it at all. But as far as I remember, it was at the Manage Participants button, and then you have like the list of the participants. And in on the bottom of this list, you have the option to raise your hand.
To raise your hand, yeah, okay. Because I can't see that. I just see about the mic, muting the mic and stuff.
See, there's one hand up.
Okay, so Roald from Norway we're going to go ahead and open your mic. And while we talk to Roald, if anybody else would like to share, please raise your hand and then we'll bring you right in. Roald.
So, hello.
Hi.
We had one theme coming up. A start of a talk or a discussion
yes.
about reflection. not so much that we reflected on ourselves, but we realized it lacks in our dojos.
It tends to lack in Japanese arts, yes.
But in where we are practicing ourselves, we don't have much reflection. The three of us that came together in the breakout room. And we started to discuss, is this a Japanese thing or not? But I myself have the feeling that Japanese do reflect, but more like private, by themselves, don't say very much aloud. But if they really have realized they've done something, they might say it aloud. But
yeah, you know, my experience in Japan is that reflection, it's not just Japan too, it's also, it's many Western dojos, that reflection is not an intentional part of the practice, but rather something reserved for social time. And in Japan, it was often mixed with beer or drinking, like a really social time, sitting around eating, drinking.
Yeah, Alex, she came up with the same example.
Right, yeah, and also there's a strict hierarchies. You know, there's these rigid hierarchies in Japan. So the reflection's always, it's from the top to the bottom. It's not really, a teacher might occasionally kind of pick your brain and see where you're at, and then maybe teach. But the just kind of open sharing thing is not so common in the Japanese structures. Although I wouldn't say it's impossible, or it's not existent, but it's very common. And I noticed that same thing in the West. That, you know, in dojos we take on that tradition for all that it's good, obviously, but also it seems to be lacking a little bit. And this reflection is certainly a postmodern practice. And, you know, the Japanese art that we're practicing is traditional and usually modern at best. So
maybe this could be a part of our 12 weeks, how to develop this part.
Exactly. We're doing it every single week. We'll be doing the reflection practice for sure. And I would encourage you in some way to take it into your dojo. I mean, even here in the dojo, I don't know what your dojo is like, but a lot of dojos are also social groups, and maybe even something like a sports club. So a friend of mine said so we don't. I got to get this right. He said we're not a dojo. Some dojos have a drinking problem. He says, no. Some Aikido clubs have a drinking problem. He says, we're a drinking club that has an Aikido problem. So, you know, that's kind of becomes the main social activity is always with some type of a drink. And again, that's fine. I don't really have judgment about that. But, you know, if we're mixing social time or even alcohol, then it's gonna lower the quality of the reflection. When it's really an intentional practice, it does kind of raise that as a practice.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Roa, thank you very much. Let's go over to Carl. Hang on just a second. Carl, your mic is open.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. How are you?
Okay, I live in Humboldt County, California.
Nice.
I think that, well, you call your dojo the integral dojo, and I think that integral is going to be impossible without reflection.
Yeah, for sure.
It's absolutely essential. And self-reflection is also absolutely essential. And it doesn't mean just knowing your own mind. It means knowing your own heart, knowing your own spirit, knowing your own soul, because that way you can connect with heart, spirit, soul in the others that you're
absolutely, yeah. And without
in your class.
and I generally call it just interiors, you know, like integral is interior and exteriors, or internal experience or external experience. And the more that I'm familiar with my internal experience, the more I can be intuitively aware of, like you said, connecting with other people's internally, their internal experience.
I agree completely. I would add curiosity to intention, because for me, that's the beginning.
Yeah.
Especially in nature. And I live way out in the hills. I live, you know, in the bushes. And nature is very important. It is literally, to me, the word of God, because rocks and trees and things don't have self-determination. They're just following the rules of the ordering of the universe. And if I get curious about something, it'll throw me off of my known area. my comfort zone, so to speak.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's very important to get to the other parts of the learning development scheme you've got going here.
No, it's really
So I
beautiful.
would encourage everybody to go for it and maximize all of these things.
Yeah, it's
Even
beautiful.
if you're weak,
Even if you what?
even if you're weak at some of them.
Yeah, especially if you're weak at some of them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like if you look at, whenever we learn something, we develop, or we a piece of the puzzle falls into place, we become more whole. And I love what you said about curiosity, because it's like we suddenly see something and we say, that's interesting. Why is it like that? There's something about our worldview that is incomplete, and curiosity draws us into more wholeness. And it's like you said, it's the beginning of that journey in a way. Well, Carl, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. If there's one more hand, if anybody else has would like to share some insights that came up from your breakout group, this would be the time to do it, or for yourself. And Kelly. Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Hi, Miles. Hi, everybody.
Where are you today?
I'm on Thetis. I'm actually in my bedroom. It's the only room that I had quiet away from the kids. So
okay.
I don't
I've seen every room of your house by this point.
I know. You know where I am.
Yeah.
I leave tomorrow for Yellowknife.
Okay.
I didn't want to share the harvest, but I wanted to just share a question that Morris raised in our group, which I thought was a great one, and wondered if you could comment on it. On the aspect of instruction, he asked, are you talking about having a teacher or an instructor, or being one? And my impression was you were talking about getting instruction, but he made the point that teaching is an amazing experience in instruction as well. I just wondered if you might comment briefly on that.
Yeah.
So being on both sides of that instruction. Teacher.
Well, it's like I said about, I mean, you're a mother too. So it's like I said about my children. I've got a 4-year-old, and she reflects stuff back to me. I'm like, whoa, I should watch my words, or I should, suddenly she's got a habit like I have a habit, or a mannerism. And it's like, wow, that's interesting. So in a way, she is a teacher. She's teaching me that way, but it's very passive. It's not like she's sensei or senpai. They've lived. It's not like she's lived before me. So I think it's somebody who, specifically, and I could be limiting myself here, so I'll leave it as an open question. But I think it's somebody who's already been along the path a bit ahead of us, and they can turn around and say, look, there's a pitfall here, there's a wrong turn there, there's a dead end here, you're going to slide backwards here, and just help us along that way. So I think it's in terms of one of the 5 aspects of development. I think that's what this was referring to. But I'll keep it as an open koan. It certainly could be my 4-year-old daughter as well. That's my greatest teacher.
Nice.
Or maybe my 8-week-old daughter. That's going to even be more.
Just wait till I get to be 13.
No. I'll enjoy them while I can. And they really bring my teacher, yeah. Great, Kelly. All right, well, have a great trip to Yellowknife, and good luck with your work there. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for joining, and have a great week of Aikido, and may you keep your Aikido at the leading edge.